if you were to say, yeah, Paul causes mobs, you're like, no, you're not seeing it clearly. It's his opponents that are causing the mobs. They're behind the scenes pulling they're puppet masters. They know how to stir people up. They know how to use slander and false accusations in order to steer people. And they're doing it, and so there's the mob. And what Paul's refusing to do is he's refusing to be cowed by the mob. He's not backing down from the mob. He sees the mob as an opportunity to be faithful, to preach the gospel. And so you got to get clear on, if I say this, I may be lighting a match, but you ought to be able to light matches.
My guest this week is Dr. Joe Rigney, and he's a Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, plus the author of the outstanding book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, Resisting the Anxiety That Will Wreck Your Family, Destroy Your Church, and Ruin the World. That's a bold claim about the power of emotional sabotage, and it's one that I can validate, because Dr. Rigney has put his finger on something that I've seen out there in the world, and that thing has now infiltrated the church. It's a silent power that doesn't wield physical force, rather emotional and verbal force to get its way, which runs counter to the gospel. And I think as a nation, we were largely unprepared for the arrival of this form of so-called soft power in the 20th century after millennia of hard power. So soft power crept in unnoticed and took over everything. It crippled every institution it touched, including evangelicalism. Stephen Wolfe, the author of The Case for Christian Nationalism, might call this the most effective weapon of the gynocracy. But now, with a resurgent church, husbands, fathers, and pastors are beginning to encounter this nameless power like I did. And it's not merely an academic question when they do. They see it weakening everything around them, including their own households and families, which is why Dr. Rigney has performed an admirable service, documenting what's going on in brief, clear language, not overburdening the point, and providing a map for faithful leaders to guide us out. In our conversation, Dr. Rigney and I discussed his journey into empathy, the unmooring of our virtues, the meaning of a mature adult, being responsible for yourself before God, why fear requires virtue, how to define respectable and credible the way that God does, and finally, being the image of God to your wife and kids. If you enjoy the Renaissance of Men podcast, thank you. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe. Plus, leave a comment down below letting us know what you thought. Big changes are coming soon for this podcast, and you can get a head start on them by visiting my new Substack at willspencerpod.substack.com. This is a new site with some features that are only available to paying subscribers, including exclusive uncensored interviews and much more. Subscriptions start at just $10 a month, so hit the link in the description to visit the new Will Spencer Podcast Substack and become a subscriber now. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, the author of Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, Dr. Joe Rigney. Pastor Rigney, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hey, glad to be here.
I've got your book here, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, with the important subtitle, Resisting the Anxiety That Will Wreck Your Family, Destroy Your Church, and Ruin the World. Fantastic, fantastic. And I want to before we get started, I want to thank you for this book because, as my listeners know, I spent a long time in the secular world. I lived in the Bay Area for about 10 years. And the principles that you articulate in here about anxiety and empathy is how the secular world works. Like when I saw that you were producing this book, I was like, oh, he's cracked the code. So I've been looking forward to speaking with you about it.
Oh, good.
So for our first question, how did you encounter the subject of empathy itself? Because I saw your Sin of Empathy talk with Pastor Wilson. Yep. When did you realize that this was like a thing?
Yeah, so I can't remember exactly how I got a hold of Friedman's book. It may have been that Doug gave it to me, or it may have been that I gave it to him, so I don't remember. But it was about a decade ago, and I read Failure of Nerve, found it really insightful and helpful, and started using it in a leadership class that I was teaching at Bethlehem, and then basically over the next 5 or so years, it was like the world conspired to prove Friedman's point.
Yep. Right.
Everything. It was all there, and he was writing, long before that, and had seen it in sort of seed form. But it was as if the world just conspired to prove the point. And so as a number of the discussions about whether it was race, whether it was about gender, whether it was about abuse, all of these sort of big issues that were substantial issues in the evangelical world and in the wider culture, all seemed to be animated and in some ways hijacked by untethered empathy, by empathy gone amok. And so at some point, after I'd been teaching courses on it, I'd been talking to other churches about the way that these dynamics were showing up in their context. We were seeing some of it even in our own, and so when I was invited to do Man Rampant, and we need to pick a topic, I said, why don't we do the sin of empathy? And then everybody, and then so we did that, and then when it released, everybody decided to prove our point again, and so it was just like one after another. You say these things, and then people really do. It does become manifest. It is a teaching opportunity for people to actually see it in action.
Absolutely. When I heard, I discovered that talk after the fact.
Okay.
So maybe within the past year or so.
Okay.
See, it was uploaded maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So maybe, can you describe some of the blowback that you received from that? Because I've heard about the blowback, but not actually seen it myself.
Yeah. So I would say kind of the first, the order of events in terms of that particular conflict, I'd filmed Man Rampant probably in 2018 or so. And then it didn't release for another 18 months. And in the meantime, I'd written a couple of articles at Desiring God, kind of in that screw tape letter format where, the first 2 articles, one of them was focusing on the way that you can kind of have the kind of compassion that doesn't ever actually want to get their hands dirty. So it keeps it at a distance, tries to steer people, shut down. Oh, you feel sad, please stop. It makes me uncomfortable. At least you have your health, that sort of thing. And so I hit that sort of ham-fisted compassion first, and then transitioned to sin of empathy, and I would say that those 2 articles, and then when the Man Rampant episode released, basically the first place it landed was in kind of the abuse advocate survivor community, and they were really unhappy with it. And so I spent a good bit of time, and some people, I would say. There was two sorts of people that were upset. One was people who were confused. They just had never heard the idea that empathy could be a problem. Like that never had occurred to them. And so they were like, are you saying all empathy is bad? Or are you saying, no, okay. So there was some clarification that I was happy to provide. And then others were clearly using that confusion as a tool of manipulation. So they didn't matter how many times I clarified, they were still going to misrepresent and try to use it as a weapon in order to do their power plays. And so over the next 3 or 4 years, basically, every so often, I kept writing things on it, responding, taking it new directions. And every few years, so often, it would blow up again. Somebody else would discover it, or it would run. Somebody else would criticize it, and so through it all. It was usually those 2. Some people hear it and they can't imagine empathy being bad. And so they just need some help, right? Well, you can think anger could be good or bad, right? Anxiety, fear could be good or bad, right? Like sometimes fear is warranted, sometimes it's unreasonable. Sometimes anger's righteous, sometimes it's unrighteous. So these other passions, right, they can be bad. Why couldn't empathy be the same way? And some people are able to get it. Others are determined not to get it because the play that they're running depends upon people not getting it.
Yes. I've got a book here by the author Simon Baron Cohen.
Okay.
This is actually Sacha Baron Cohen's brother. It's called The Essential Difference.
Okay.
It's a book about neurological differences in brain structure between men and women. So he's an atheist. So differences in brain structure between men and women is about as close as an atheist will ever get to God. And so in here, he says that the female brain is designed for empathizing. Yeah. And he defines empathy. And he says empathy has an imaginative and an affective component. Mm-hmm. So the imaginative component is you imagine yourself in the other person's shoes, and then you imagine how you would feel, this is the affective component, if you were in their shoes. So I'm imagining myself in the quicksand, how would I feel? And then we're supposed to feel that. Yeah. And never question it, which sounds like what you touched on. Yeah,
and I think in that respect, the important thing, and I stressed this from the beginning, that in and of itself, that's a very human, God-designed thing, both in general and for women. I think that part of the reason, the strength of women in that respect is that intuitive emotion sharing that allows them to be first responders when people are hurting. They're just right there, and they just kick into gear, and it's a good and grand and glorious thing. The problem comes when you take it out of that context and it becomes unmoored from any other concerns, any other issues. And just the other day, so I preached on this the other day at our church, and I had come across a C.S. Lewis quote, or actually it was Chesterton. Is the modern virtues have gone mad. The old Christian virtues in the modern world, old Christian virtues have gone mad because they've become unmoored from one another. So on the one hand, you have the scientists pursue truth, but their truth is pitiless, and the humanitarian elevates pity, what he called pity, but their pity's untruthful. Their pity's untethered from truth. And so you have pitiless truth or untruthful pity, untruthful empathy. And it's those things we actually have to keep these things together. We have to keep them tethered to something sturdier than our own feelings.
Mm-hmm. So when as all this is kind of landing on you, you put out these talks, you write these articles, everyone's setting out to prove you right, and they're doing a good job of it. When did the book begin to kind of come together? Like, I should probably write a book about this, but not just a book, but more like a manual?
Yeah.
Or as Pastor Wilson says, a map?
Yeah, a map. So so part of the way the book came together was when I moved out here to Moscow. I've had friends who've gotten into Friedman and read it, but have always had the same thing that I had, which is it's a really great paradigm. His paradigm for dealing not just with empathy but just leadership in general is a really helpful one for navigating family conflict, for navigating workplace stuff, church stuff. But you have to wade through a lot of stuff. It's not the sort of book that you could just give to anybody, because some people are going to stumble over some of Friedman's categories, his psychological language, the evolutionary roots that he's grounding everything in. And so when I came out here, they just said, "Hey, you've been doing this for a while. Would you want to could you pull that together into some talks or into a book or something?" And so I said, "Sure." And it came together actually relatively quickly, partly because it was the emerging of a couple of different streams. One was, for the last few years, I had been translating Friedman's concept of self-differentiated leader as sober-minded. So I had been thinking and talking in terms of when we talk about somebody being a mature adult, what do we mean? And sober-mindedness had kind of become this organizing virtue as a way of thinking of someone who is steady, stable, grounded, clear-eyed, but also engaged, not checked out. So there's a certain kind of person who can analyze stuff, but they're emotionally totally uninvested, and they're not going to do anything. And then there's another kind who's just going to do, and they're going to get led by the feelings. Well, you need somebody who's grounded, steady, stable, has a stability of soul, but is ready to act in the right way, and is governed by reason, governed by what's true, governed by what's good. And so I'd already been doing that, and that had been sort of my own take on Friedman over the last few years. And then I'd done a lot of thinking about manhood and womanhood, and the way that, what does it mean for a man to be the head of his home? What does it mean for the woman to be the body? What this head body idea, what was that, and how do we better articulate both what's sort of the facts of nature, just the way things are, doesn't matter whether you want them to be this way or not, this is facts. And then, in light of those facts, how should we live? What does it mean to be a faithful head? What does it mean to be a faithful member of the body? And so I'd been working on that separately. And so you kind of had Friedman, you had my sober-mindedness stuff, and you had this manhood, womanhood stuff. And then the various experiences I'd been through, preaching. I preached through the book of Acts. I'd seen enough manipulations and pressures and stresses that it all just kind of like came together and was able to be wrapped up into 6 pretty short chapters. So all in all, there was a timeliness thing that I'm grateful God's been kind to pull it all together.
Mm-hmm. And you produced a course, which I watched as well, or a series of conversations with Pastor Wilson, and then a course. Maybe you can talk about those also, and then we'll walk through some of the content. Yeah.
So the first thing was that the Canon asked to do, hey, let's do a little course. And so we did 6 sessions, put those on Canon Plus, and that was the initial ask. And then I said, I wrote about 17,000 words getting ready for this course. I could probably add another 10 and it'd be a nice little book. And they said, great. And so that was, the course was first, then the book. And then kind of coming out of it, Friedman wrote these fables to kind of illustrate some of his fundamental principles. And Canon had the idea, why don't we have you and Doug talk about these fables, because they can be a little bit surprising. They're just a little bit, whoa, that's the way good fables, good myths work that way. They kind of grab your attention. And but then they gave us a good kind of base from which to launch to talk about how does this show up in your home, or how does this show up in the church or in the culture. And so we put together those 4 little episodes also on Canon Plus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd never heard of Friedman's Fables, but hearing you and Doug work through them, it's like, oh, I've seen this 1,000 times in my life. This is basically how the secular world works, right? Especially the rope. Like maybe talk about the rope and the bridge example quickly, and then we'll just use that to set the stage of what the kind of fable looks like and what they articulate.
Yeah, so there's one of the fables is a guy's going on a journey. He comes to a bridge. Another guy's walking across the bridge, and the hero of the story is trying to get where he's going to go. He's got a vision for his life, and the other guy comes up, hands him a rope, and then jumps over, and then basically holds him hostage. So I'm not, the guy's like, I'll help pull you up, and the guy, the hanger, is saying, no, you'll just hold on. And these are these moments where you realize you're in a hostage situation, where the other person is basically saying, if you don't, you're emotionally responsible for me, and you're like, I'm your problem, and it's not that I'm your problem in the way that God expects, So a husband's the head of his home; he's responsible for his household. It's not that. It's actually I'm denying. The person who's holding hostage, the hostage taker, is saying, my emotional state is entirely up to you, but it's not really up to you. I'm denying all agency, and I'm going to hold you hostage. And you see that in all sorts of places. You can see it in extended families. The example I used the other day in the sermon was, this is how the trans movement operates. The question, would you rather have a dead son or a living daughter? Is a great example of someone saying, here. So you have somebody's, you have a boy, parents, have a son, and he's been groomed into gender ideology and now is convinced he's a girl. And the activists will come and say, look, mom, dad, you need to get on board with this. And if you don't, you're going to end up with a dead son. And so if you don't want a dead son, you better accept your new living daughter, and you better pay for the surgeries and the hormone blockers and everything else. And it's basically a hostage situation. It says, mom and dad, if they do something, if they kill themselves, it's your fault. It's your fault. Yeah. And that, what are they doing? They're playing on the parents' compassion. Here, parents are compassionate. God designed them to be, as a father has compassion on his children, so shall the Lord have compassion on you. Shall a mother forget her nursing child? Shall she fail to have compassion on the child of her womb? These are biblical texts that say, fathers and mothers are exhibit A of compassion and empathy and pity and whatever word you want to use. And so that also means there's a danger that they can be manipulated by it, and clever ungodly agents will figure out how to exploit it.
So let's make this grounded and practical then. So not everyone's going to be dealing, although someone listening may be dealing with this exact situation with the trans son, the dead son, living daughter. But it seems like everyone has at least one situation probably in their lives where someone has thrown the rope around them and says, now you are responsible for me, and if you don't do what I say, then the hostage gets it, and I happen to be the hostage. Right. So like how can men and women too, how can they spot these situations when they're coming, and how can they in the moment wield the righteous no, or what is the right response in that?
Yeah. So I think a couple of things is first getting clear. So recognizing when it's happening is often a matter first of becoming more aware of your own passions. So because oftentimes, paying attention to your own hesitations, reluctances, aversions, your angers, your anxieties, because oftentimes we intuitively are aware of the social environment. We know what's expected of us. When you go home for Christmas, that there's certain topics you stay away from, certain things when people get agitated, you just, kind of begin to maneuver around. So we all do this sort of intuitively and naturally to avoid relational pain, basically. We want to avoid the emotional pain, relational pain, and we get very adept at dodging. So the first step is becoming aware of when you're doing that automatically. When are you ducking? When are you avoiding? And you can tell that by your own passions. Here's the thing I could say in this moment that would set everybody off. And then you have to ask, okay, am I doing that because of wisdom? Because there's an issue that needs to be addressed, but now's not the right time, but I'm going to address it later. Or am I doing so out of cowardice? I don't want to deal with it. I'm fearing man. And so that's how you diagnose when you're doing it. That's one of the key ways you diagnose. Then it's getting more clear on the nature of responsibility. What does God act? Who are you responsible for, and how? How are you responsible for it? So your first and fundamental responsibility is for yourself. You stand before God, and you're responsible to Him for you. You're responsible for your emotions, your attitudes. You're responsible for your actions, for your words, for your deeds. You'll give an account for every bit of it to the Lord. He's the one you're responsible to Him. Then if you're in leadership, you're also responsible for those under you, but you're not to blame for everything under you. So you're responsible, which means you need to address it. But part of, like if you're a pastor of a church, you're going to be held account for what happened in your congregation. But what that doesn't mean is every sin in your congregation will be imputed to you. What it means is when you discovered or saw the sin, when you saw that issue, what did you do? Did you lean in? Did you address it? Did you rebuke, correct, exhort? Did you use the word? Did you bring it to bear? That's what you'll be held responsible for, your actions and what you ought to do. And they'll be held responsible for what they did. And so this is like with Adam and Eve, right? Eve sinned, but when God, both of them sinned. Eve sinned first, but when God showed up, He wanted to talk to Adam. Why? Because Adam was the head. Adam, where are you? I want to talk to you because you're responsible for the whole thing. I gave you the law of the garden. You were responsible to teach it to your wife and to, make sure she knew what the law of the garden was. And then you were responsible to guard and protect this place from evil. Now you're naked. Now you've clothed yourself. Who told you that you were naked? Why are you hiding? So He wants to talk to Adam because Adam's the head. But that doesn't mean that Eve can say, well, if Adam's the head, I don't have any responsibility here. No, that's not true. Eve's responsible for herself. So that blame shifting thing that all humans want to do, we want to offload blame, offload responsibility to others, is the thing that you have to lean in with. You have to say, no, I'm responsible for certain things, but not for other things. And so that's what prevents the hostage situation.
Can you speak a word of encouragement into men who are experiencing this currently in their lives, and they know with their families or their workplaces or their friends that if they say the thing, everything will blow up, and they will get blamed for the explosion because everything was going along just fine, quote unquote, before, and then you had to go and say the thing, and now all of this chaos, now it's all on you. Now, obviously, we know in our hearts that's false, but can you speak a word of encouragement to men that are facing situations like that?
Yeah, this is where courage is needed. So you get clear on what's happening, get clear on it. So that means someone can be the occasion for a blow up and not the cause of the blow up. So when Paul's, in the book, I talk about Paul in the book of Acts, and everywhere Paul goes, there's a mob. And so the optical illusion that can result from that is Paul causes mobs. And it's actually, Paul is preaching the gospel. What's happening is his opponents are following him around, and everywhere he goes, they lie, they slander, they stir up mobs in order to oppose him. This is an effective means of trying to put a damper on the gospel proclamation. So if you were to say, yeah, Paul causes mobs, you're like, no, you're not seeing it clearly. It's his opponents that are causing the mobs. They're behind the scenes pulling they're puppet masters. They know how to stir people up. They know how to use slander and false accusations in order to steer people. And they're doing it, and so there's the mob. And what Paul's refusing to do is he's refusing to be cowed by the mob. He's not backing down from the mob. He sees the mob as an opportunity to be faithful, to preach the gospel. And so you got to get clear on, if I say this, I may be lighting a match, but you ought to be able to light matches. Okay? The issue is somebody else has been pumping gas into this room, and that's what's going to blow up. But it's the person that's pumping the gas that's responsible for it, not me. So I'm going to own my words, but my words ought to be not, my words are not, if you're speaking the truth, then it ought to be uncontroversial. If you, in heaven, if you said what you said, would the angels react? That sort of question, right? Would the saints who have been made righteous, if you said whatever thing that you're going to say in the setting, would they approve it or disapprove it? That's how you should calibrate yourself. What does God think about this? What does the Word say? That's the true calibration. Then it's, okay, now in this context, I'm going to say it and it's going to be uncomfortable. And then you're ready to deal with the blowback. So you know you're going to do it. And that's where you have to steel yourself with, I know what God thinks. I know who I am. I'm seeking his approval. I'm going to speak plainly and clearly. I'm going to be master of myself. God's restored control of me to me. I'm self-controlled and sober-minded. My passions aren't running amok inside. So I'm going to take this blowback knowing that it's coming, and I'm going to try to lead through it. That's what God calls leaders to do.
Mm-hmm. So I asked first about men because I think courage and disagreeableness, to use a Jordan Peterson word, is something that's very inherent to men. We're supposed to be disagreeable. Combat, battle is disagreeable. But I think one of the things we're also facing today is women having the need to be disagreeable about particularly sins about feminism, for example, that show up within families and manipulation. And so I've spoken to a number of women that see many things going wrong within their families, within their friend groups, and they want to speak into it. But women aren't maybe necessarily characterologically designed, made to be disagreeable in that way. Can you speak a word of encouragement to women as well in this regard?
Yeah, so we definitely see, so while women are not designed by God to be frontline fighters, when, battles are, Lewis said, battles are ugly when women fight. And then he still gave Susan that bow and arrow. Mm-hmm. So in Narnia, Lewis, Father Christmas tells Susan, battles are ugly when women fight. You're not supposed to be in the front lines. But there are times when everything's coming apart where you're going to need that bow and arrow. You're going to need that dagger. And so there is a place, and all women ought to be women of courage. Sarah in the Bible is a model of courage. So in 1 Peter, we're told, be like the holy women who hoped in God, be like Sarah who submitted to Abraham, calling him Lord, who did good and did not fear anything that was frightening. Mm-hmm. So that fear, a woman could say, this is going to be awkward in my friend group if I bring up, but this is wrong. God doesn't, this is false. This is not true to the scriptures. Yes, it will be awkward. And there's a hurdle that you have to get over because of the agreeableness, the natural female agreeableness. But faithfulness demands it. It's still, do you care what God thinks or do you care what man thinks? Are you seeking to be approved by the world, by your friends, or are you going to be approved by the Lord? That's the fundamental thing that you've got to get straight and you've got to anchor yourself in.
This pastoral advice is fantastic. So to follow on from that, let's say that you're in the room full of people, right? Whether you're man or woman, the room's full of gas, the chronic anxiety, you light the match, the thing blows up, and nothing is ever the same again in any kind of way. Help counsel people through what to do in that moment of grief. Like, I've just lost this thing that was precious to me. How would you counsel somebody in that situation who's sitting with that?
Yeah. So then I think, part of what you're doing is maybe this would be even part of the advice before you do it, is you're entrusting it to God, right? So a big part of what you're doing in being willing to say it is, Lord, I'm going to say these words, and everything that happens after that, I'm going to say the truth. I'm going to resist the lie, whatever it is. I'm going to be faithful, and I'm leaving the results in your hands. And so in the aftermath, if it went sideways, so first let's start with, sometimes we say the thing that we think is going to be a problem, and we're actually shocked that half the people in the room are like, thank you. Like this actually happens more than you think, where you weren't the only one. Everybody else was uncomfortable with it too. They just hadn't got there yet. They hadn't gotten to the courage point. And it's you saying, hey, actually, I don't think we need to do this. It's you saying, no, we're not going to cater to that. No, we're not going to coddle that. And a bunch of people come up to you after and say, thank you. You might, or you discover that if it's in a family context, that one of your siblings had also had the same thought about your extended relative who was causing a problem. And now what happens is, in that moment, you actually bind with them in a certain way. You're forming the nucleus of a more healthy system, because it's one that's built on the truth and upon what God thinks and not what the world thinks. The reason the other one's so unhealthy is because it's shot through with worldliness. Yours, you're trying to build something healthier. So sometimes just know you might say it and people actually might get on board. But say they don't. Say that the herd instinct kicks in and everybody tries to shout you down or get you to apologize. In that moment, you're entrusting the whole thing to the Lord, and you're saying, Lord, I don't see the way out. I don't see how this could ever be any better. but I'm going to be faithful, and I'm going to leave it in your hands, and just keep doing that daily. I think when it comes to one of the little bits in the book that I don't know if people fully appreciate, but I've appreciated it more and more in recent years, is the way that Job at the beginning. Part of what Job made Job a faithful leader and a faithful father was his kids are having their parties, and he's regularly going before the Lord and saying, Lord, I'm going to offer these sacrifices to you on behalf of my kids, just in case they'd sinned and cursed you in their hearts. Right? And so what Job is doing there is taking responsibility for his kids. He's like, I can't reach in there and turn their sin on and off. I don't have that power. Nobody has that power for another person. You don't even have that for yourself. You need the grace of God to change your own heart. So I don't have the power, but I can, Lord, bring it before you and say, I'm responsible. These are my children. And so as the head, I'm going to take responsibility for them. And so that's what you're going to do both before and after, both when it's still simmering and when it's finally blown up, is say, Lord, yep, okay, I said it. I took a stand. I had some nerve. I didn't go along the way that we've always gone along in the past. I stood my ground, and now everybody's mad at me. So Lord, I'm entrusting this to you. You're going to have to bring something out and help me in the meantime to be cheerful, to be joyful, to rejoice, because they're saying all kinds of false things about me. Lord, help me to obey Jesus, who said, when they say false things about you, go do a dance, go have a party. Mm-hmm. You're blessed. Help me to receive that, and help me to maintain my humility. I want to think your thoughts. I want to be wise. I want to be gracious. So you're you'll notice that what's happening is you're actually becoming a more dependent person. You're becoming more dependent upon the Lord, and therefore independent respect to people, mm-hmm. right? Like because you're depending on the Lord, you actually have the ability to stand against the crowd, and that's where that's where you want to live. Live there.
Mm-hmm. You used a word that I think doesn't get used enough these days, but I think is very accurate. Have some nerve, mm-hmm. like the word have some nerve. Yeah. Maybe can you unpack that a little bit? Because that's a concept we've lost in our world today, I think.
Yeah, it's a way of talking about courage, fortitude, backbone, any of those sort of terms. It's here's a hard thing and it could be social pressure, it could be objective danger, right? It doesn't matter what it is, that produces fear in me. And so the question is my fear going to run me? Is the fear in charge? Does the fear win? Does the fear lead? So the presence of fear is not a problem. If the fear wasn't there, then there would be no possibility of the virtue being there either, right? Mm-hmm. So you need the fear, because you need then the grace of God acting through your mind and heart to overcome it, and mm-hmm. to not give way, to not buckle. And so if you're standing firm, then we'd say, oh, he's got fortitude because he's standing firm. If it's you have to move forward, you'd say he's taking a risk, he's being courageous. But in both cases, you're planting your feet, you're standing firm in the face of challenge, sabotage, steering, pressure, consequences. I'm gonna be faithful to the Lord no matter what.
Mm-hmm. So we've started sort of in the home, the friend, the family structure, and in the book, that's where you start, and then you start building out into the church and into the world. Mm-hmm. So maybe let's start with the church, because I think the world is being confronted in some ways, but these conflicts that crackle, this anxiety exists within so many churches, and I think people are rightfully afraid to light a match. But maybe in some ways they kind of have to. So maybe we can spend some time maybe have to isn't the right word, but maybe it's necessary would be a better way of putting that.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I've been writing about more recently, and we'll probably try to pull some things together even in the future, but it's kind of a follow-on to the Sabotage book, is what are the mechanics of it? And so I mentioned in the book that often worldliness gets laundered through other Christians. Meaning you've got the worldly things happening over there, and you don't care what the world says because you've got enough backbone. You know what Jesus said. The world will hate us. It's mm-hmm. okay. Mm-hmm. But there's a Christian who's closer to them who does care and has compromised. But you don't care what that Christian says because that they're a compromised Christian. That denomination's unfaithful. That church is unfaithful. So you don't care about that. But then there's a person one step closer to you who does care what that group thinks, and there's a person, and so it's just this chain. And the hard thing to resist is the one that's close to you, right? And this is what, the illustration in the book is when Peter withdrew from the Gentiles because of certain pressures from the circumcision party, which probably means the unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem. And so it's like, how did that work? Well, those unbelieving Jews were making trouble for the church in Jerusalem. James was, people are getting persecuted. They're getting, kicked out of the synagogues, thrown in jail. James is worried about this. He sends messengers to Peter. So now you've got 3 steps, 3 people involved. And those men come to Peter and they say, look, if you keep eating with the Gentiles, it's making it really tough for us. People are not liking it. Our reputation is shot. Could you maybe back off? And just for a little bit, maybe just for a season, we're not told the details, but it's not hard to imagine the kinds of appeals that would be made in that kind of setting. And Peter goes, okay. And he withdraws and then leads Barnabas, comes along with Peter. And then the rest of the Jews come along with Peter. And then it takes Paul to finally say, but wait a minute. No, this is wrong. And to actually take the stand, to oppose Peter to his face, to light the match, which may be really awkward. And you don't know, is it going to blow up or is it going to make peace? And so that's the sort of thing that the way that the world launders its influence through other Christians. So the way I've come to talk about this isn't in the book, but it's coming out of the book, I would say, is that oftentimes the Christians live under the progressive gaze, under the progressive eyes. So
eyes,
eyes, not progressive gaze, not GAYS, GAZE, and I actually get the term.
Both true.
I guess they're both true. But I actually got the term from Toni Morrison, who's a novelist, African American novelist, who kind of popularized this, talking about the white gaze. And what she meant was, there's a way, with her as a Black author, she always felt like that there was this presumption that her true audience was white people, and so that she needed to speak and act and write in such a way that was her main audience. She was trying to make sure they were the ones evaluating. White people were the ones evaluating. And it was something like, she basically felt like there was this little white man sitting on her shoulder saying, sort of furrowed brow, well, that doesn't make sense. And, and so she said, I couldn't just describe my own experience because I was not writing. And so she said, I had to really work to get that guy off my shoulder and write for the audience I wanted to write for. Well, what it is it's actually just a really creative way to talk about people pleasing. Right? Like,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like, at some level, it's like the worldly gaze, the progressive gaze, the white gaze, whatever gaze is just a person on your shoulder who's evaluating everything you do. And Christians, this is the thing, Christians have gotten in a habit of doing this by saying, well, the world is watching. The world is watching. And it's like, that's true. Jesus says, they'll know you're Christians by your love for one another. They're watching. And it's like, but who else is watching? Is the Lord watching? What does he think about what we just said? What does he think about what we're doing? That's, again, the more fundamental question. But because when the church lives underneath the progressive gaze, when it lives under that sense of judgment, it will then seek to cater and accommodate and placate progressive ideologies, progressive sins. It will speak softly about things that progressives want us to speak softly about, and it will drop a big hammer. This is the origin of the phenomenon where we talk about people who will punch right but coddle left, right? So things that are associated with the right that are culturally unacceptable, the church will just drop hammers, no nuance, no. Let's try to understand that perspective. Nope, just boom, drop it. And then on the other hand, to the left, it's we got to nuance this. We got to be winsome here. And it's like, what's happening is there's a little progressive sitting on the shoulder that's dictating how and when and why we speak. That's how the church and the world. And this is the hard thing for a leader, is it's often the first fight is not with the world, but it's with your elder team. It's your elder team. It's the 3 guys in that room who have that little progressive on their shoulder, and you're going, but we're just drifting. We're being steered left. We're being moved left. We're being moved in a progressive, liberal, unbiblical direction. And it's, how do I stop it? Well, it's going to take some courage, some nerve to stand up to them, just like Paul had to stand up to Peter.
So there could be someone listening who could be like, that's all well and good, but I'm not Paul. Right. And like push back on that a little bit.
Yeah. I'd say, well, you better be. If you're a leader, you are. I mean, like
There you go.
Paul says, if whatever you've heard and seen in me, practice these things, do it. He puts himself forward, imitate me as I imitate Christ, he says. So Paul puts himself forward as a model for other leaders, for Timothy, for churches. We're supposed to look at Paul and go, how did he handle these kind of situations? Because he's seeking to follow Christ. So I would say, you may not be Paul in that you're not an apostle, but you are the leader in that room. And so the question is, will you be faithful at your post just as he was faithful at his post?
So what can Christians listening then do to root out the progressive gaze that lives over their shoulder? Because it seems to me that it's a very powerful force within the church today. Like it's just living right there.
Yeah.
The progressive gaze, the science man gaze, like all these different gazes are sitting on Christian shoulders, and it's not the gospel.
Yeah, right. So I would say this is what I think this was Toni Morrison. She just said, you just got to flick that guy off. Just and then, but the thing is here's the danger. This is the to borrow a Jesus image. He says you cast out one demon and then you leave the house swept clean. 7 more worse than the first come back and re-inhabit. So it's like it's not enough to simply say I'm not. Oftentimes what we're doing when we're writing for that gaze is we're trying to manage results. We're trying to we're not simply trying to be faithful. We're trying to manage consequences and results. And so the first step is you're not God. You have no control over consequences and results. You can't predict it. You can't, with an absolute way, you can sort of anticipate things, wisdom. You can sort of read, okay, I think I know how this is going to go, but you don't have any control over what happens. You're not God. And so I'm not God. I'm going to step out of that role by trying to manage and be God. I got a friend who talks about, we think of evangelism as being God's PR guy, right? We've got to be his PR spokesman to try to spin everything to help appeal to the audience. And it's like, you're not God's PR guy. Your task, you're God's herald. Say what he said. Okay? Say what he said. And where the thing does come into play is, which, by your own hesitations, which things you say are going to cause that. And it's often, that's the signal of what faithfulness means there. Right? What it's no good to gather all the, I'm going to gather all these Christians in a room and I'm going to preach about the sins that aren't in the room. I'm going to gather all the Christians and I'm going to address all kinds of sin, and I can thunder and I'm going to get amen, amen, amen. And it's all about sins that are in that church across town or in that world over there. We're blasting those. Now, there's a place for that because these Christians are going to go out there and they need to know how to live. So you do want to equip people. But if that's all you're doing and you never address the sins in the room, you're always trying, what sins are in the room? What sins are in the room? That's the sin that's most pressing. And if you're avoiding that one, but still thundering against the other one, then you're not being faithful because you're living before the gaze of your audience, right? Rather than the gaze of God. And then, but if you live under God's gaze, if you say, all right, I want to be faithful, and I know what faithfulness looks like here, what you'll often find is God blesses it, right? God will bless it. And the blessing might be persecution. It might be that kind of hard mercy, right? Like sometimes happens in the New Testament. And other times, thousands of people get saved. Thousands of people go, oh, finally, someone said it. Where are the Christians who were just testifying to the way things are? And they go, now I want to, let me hear more. We'll hear you more about, how many times did Paul have these two reactions in the book of Acts? Some people mocked it. Some people, blew up about it. They mocked it, they derided it, they tried to persecute him. And then other people were like, we'd like to hear more about this. Because it was plain, direct, no waffling. He's trying to be winsome. He is attempting to sort of make it comprehensible, but he's not trying to shade it. So one of the dangers is sometimes you'll see pastors who speak in order to be misunderstood. I've got a friend who he's working on a project all along these lines. The pastors who are going to say something knowing that one audience will hear it one way and another audience will hear it a different way. And it allows them to sort of have plausible deniability in both. No, I didn't say that. But to this group, oh, I did say that, right? And you're speaking to muddle things, not speaking to be clear. And the number of times where Paul, or the apostles, one of my favorite things about the apostles is, whenever in the early part of Acts, Peter and James and John are preaching to the crowds, and then they get hauled before the authorities. And the authorities are like, you're trying to make us guilty of this man's blood. You're saying that, we're guilty of the murder of the Messiah. And they're like, yes, that's what we're saying. I'm glad we are communicating. That is, yes, you murdered the author of life and God raised him from the dead. You've got it. What? And Jesus does the same thing, right? When he condemns, I think he's condemning the Pharisees at one point, and the scribes said, Rabbi, in condemning that, you condemn us also. And Jesus says, yeah, about the scribes, and just launches into round two. And it's like that's, because what's he aiming for? He's aiming for clarity, right? You're always, like, a fundamental thing for leaders is you're always aiming for clarity. You want to bring clarity.
Please say more about that real quick, because I can see there's a ditch on the road, on one side of the road, of not saying anything at all. And then there, especially with social media, there's the ditch on the side of the road of making your entire personality about saying the thing, right? So how do people who have the courage to get up out of one ditch avoid navigating straight into the other one, or even down the road into the other one?
Yeah, so I think, especially when it comes to the social media question, it's important that all of your efforts to export via social media are grounded in real life community. That you're not treating that online persona as a substitute for a life well lived with God's people in a particular place. And so sometimes I think that part of the way it can go wrong is that people have taken, this is a category from a friend of mine named Josh Mitchell, who's written some articles on it, but you take something that's designed to be a supplement and it becomes a substitute. So you can think about the way that, vitamins are meant to be a substitute or supplement for meals, but if you replace meals with vitamins and all you're doing is vitamins, it's like something's off. It's a similar thing with kind of social media. If that's designed to breed connection, but it's not designed to replace face-to-face embodied life. And so I would say that's the first check I would have is, if I was somebody saying, hey, here's what my life looks like. Am I doing too much? Am I too online? And I would say, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what is it like with your wife and your kids? How much is your orientation towards out there online? Not because being a man and being outwardly oriented, I got to go build something is good. God designed us for that. Take dominion, right? But is the thing that you're building start in your home and then in your community, or is it entirely digital? And if it's entirely digital, the danger is it can be so carefully curated and manicured. You can present women do it with their Instagram accounts. Here's the life, where it's a fake life, it's a curated life. It shows some true things, but it masks all of reality, and therefore creates a false impression. Similar thing can happen with anonymous Twitter accounts or whatever you want to say. Like there's and I know there's good reasons that some people are anonymous. Sure. They could lose their job or whatever. That's fine. But if you lean into that anonymous identity and not into your embodied reality with your family, your church, if you're not in community with real people, then it's a good bet that that's going to take on a life of its own and just become another way that your passions will be steered.
So you mentioned in the book the difference between apostles of the world versus refugees of the world, and speaking to those two. So one of the questions that I had in response to that was, how do we speak to apostles of the world knowing that the refugees are listening, right? Because no one tweet can speak to both people. So how do we navigate that for those of us who are called to speak truth with clarity?
Yeah, good. This is one of the things, to circle all the way back to whenever the empathy thing kind of blew up, I was always trying to discern, as people would throw comments or make criticisms, which one am I dealing with? And I would self-consciously respond to both publicly, and I would do so in different ways. So, in other words, sometimes it was clear, and I would try to do there would be a little bit of sharper, I'd be trying to, this is combat, and I'm trying to do that. And then any other time when I thought there's a good chance that this person is confused or has been lied to or has been manipulated by these other people, I'm going to just totally try to diffuse all of it. I'm not taking, so it was never personal, and it was always, oh, hey, it's a great question. Let me answer that. And the goal was, this is something I picked up from the Apostle Paul. was surprise. Okay, the importance of surprising people. So if you remember in the story that I do in the book in the last chapter, where he's before that audience, they've been told he's a Gentile-loving Greekophile who hates Moses. And then when he gets beat up, he gets arrested. Then he asks, "Can I go back out and speak to the people?" And the tribune says, "Sure." And so he goes back out, and they're chanting. It's a mob. And what he does is he immediately begins speaking in flawless Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And you go, why is it significant? Why does the Bible record that detail? He'd spoken Greek to the tribune, and he comes out and he's speaking Hebrew. And it says that the crowd responded by being hushed into silence. They were like, "Wait, what?" And he surprised them. They didn't think this guy knew Hebrew. They certainly didn't think he knew that kind of Hebrew. And so he surprised them. And so I'm always, when I think about that, I'm going, if someone comes out with a snarky comment, but I think it's because of a confusion, or at least there might be other people watching that, I'll often deliberately go, I'm not going to take the bait and hit back in kind. Instead, I'll absorb it and try to just say, oh, happy to be clear. I don't want there to be confusion. Let me answer that question. And so they were not asking a good faith question, but I will answer it in a good faith because I have my eye on the refugees. I want people to kind of go, well, that's not what I thought he would do. I thought he would be really snarky back. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I would do it. Is I am aware, especially in online interactions, it is a combat zone, but you do have non-combatants or you have confused combatants. And going, I'm not trying to necessarily persuade the person I'm talking to, because in all likelihood, if they're an apostle, there's not going to be, and because of the nature of the case, they're in a combat situation, they're going to dig in even if they think I'm right, they're going to dig in, right? Like in other words, if I were to answer their objection in a way that was compelling, they're going to dig in because they'd lose face. And so online interactions are combat, and so people will dig in on stupid stuff because they don't want to lose face. They can't admit that they were wrong. It's like, that's okay. I'm not worried about winning them, but I am worried about people who are observing and who are trying to understand what's the big deal about all of this? What's the big controversy all about? And that's where, and so that's where I'm wanting to define respectable and credible the way God does, right? Not the way the world does. Because the world's going to use respectability. Well, if you don't believe this, you're not respectable, and they're going to try to steer you by it. The world is watching. And I'm saying, well, there's truth in wanting to be respectable, but I want my respectability insofar as it's determined or shaped by outsiders. Like, I want to have a good reputation with outsiders. I want it to be people who've actually seen me up close and personal, who've watched me coach baseball with my kids. If unbelievers in those contexts saw me and they said, well, we hate what he thinks, but we got to admit that he's a really good baseball coach and really cared for the kids well. Mm-hmm. That's the standard. That's that good reputation with outsiders. Not random anonymous person online says, you're evil, and therefore I have a bad reputation. It's like, who cares about that? Instead, I'm going to speak over that to this other group who's just observing.
Mm-hmm. Make them have to contextualize what they might find as sharp words in the larger picture of a man.
Exactly right. That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned baseball. So do you mind if we transition to talking about Strangely Bright real quick?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, cool. I really enjoyed that book. By the way, did you intend for Strangely Bright and Emotional Sabotage to come out at the same time, or was that just sort of like providential?
No, so Strangely Bright actually came out, it was first released, I want to say, a couple years ago. So Crossway published it first, and it's actually the little cousin of a larger book called The Things of Earth, which I published back in 2015, 2016. So The Things of Earth was the first version, how do you treasuring God by enjoying his gifts. And that book was helpful to a lot of people, but it was a big fat book. And so I then said, I'm going to rework the content and write a smaller version that you can give to your mom. The kind of, like write a little book that she'll read because she's not going to read a big fat one maybe. And so I wrote Strangely Bright, and then and it just so happened that it released at the same time. It re-released. So this new release that Canon just did was a re-release of an old book. But that was an attempt to kind of give it new life, get it into new circles.
Because I noticed that the Strangely Bright cover is green, the Emotional Sabotage cover is yellow.
Yeah.
And I think they both deal with some uneasiness that it seems to me that modern evangelical Christians have with the world.
Yeah.
First is around the question of the righteous use of power.
Yep.
And then Strangely Bright is the righteous enjoyment of pleasure. I thought that was an interesting and providential juxtaposition.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I would say, Things of Earth came first and was really about, okay, we want to be, we're supremacy of God people. God is greatest. God is the best. God is the chief good, the ultimate good, highest good. But then there's all the stuff. What do we do? How do we enjoy it rightly? How do we steward it rightly? How do we not abuse it, commit idolatry, but also say thank you? All of those kind of questions was the Things of Earth Strangely Bright. And then basically what's happened is I was wrestling with that question probably beginning like 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those years are when I'd been newly married and was trying to navigate that as a Christian hedonist. God is most glorified in me when I'm most satisfied in Him, but now what with all the gifts? So that book emerged out of that season. And then I think what's happened is culturally the conversation has shifted, like you said, to the use of power or the question of culture, the question of politics, the question of social order, which is basically an extension of how do we live in the world. Right? Like the common thing is, I've got to live in a world. It's a world of pleasures, and it's a world of sin, and a world of power. It's how do you live faithfully there if you've made God supreme because Jesus is Lord. And so that you're right to recognize there is a shared approach to that question in both of those books.
So I listened to Strangely Bright. Now, normally I read physical books, so I can highlight and make notes, but I listened to Strangely Bright, so I don't have any notes in front of me. So let's walk through the argument of Strangely Bright a little bit while preserving some of the mystery and the enjoyment of people to listen or read it.
Sure. Yeah, so the basic idea is if you believe that whom have I in heaven but you? On earth there's nothing I desire beside you, speaking to God. So God, there's nothing I desire. Then, and that's Psalm 73. Should you live? How should you, okay, Lord, there's only you, all you. And then you look down the row at church and there's your family. What about them? Do you desire them? Do you love them? Do you enjoy them? That's the tension that the book's trying to address. And the first and fundamental place is that, well, why did God make that world? Why did He make a world in which He's supreme, but which is filled with all kinds of pleasures, all kinds of enjoyments, all kinds of goodness? Whether it's I talk in the book about sensible pleasures like food and drink and things that are pleasurable to the bodily senses, relational pleasures, which is people, and then vocational pleasures, the things you do that are enjoyable. The world is just shot full with all this stuff. Why? And it's because God wants to communicate Himself, and He's basically He's communicating Himself in the things that He's made. This is how the Bible, heavens declare the glory of God. His invisible attributes have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. And so that's why God made them, is that they're meant to be revelations of His own character, His own glory, His own grace, and they're meant to draw us back to Him. Well, that means if that's why they're there, well, you can't there's no shortcut. You've got to go through the things. He's given the things to lead us to Him, so follow the things.
So was this a question for Christians prior to now, or has this always been present, or is this just a modern manifestation?
No, I think it's a universal, as old as dirt problem. The problem has always been, how do you navigate the two fundamental sins, you can say in the book of Romans. Romans 1 begins with this description of human sin. The bottom line sins there are idolatry and ingratitude. They don't honor God as God, nor do they give thanks. Those are the two fundamental sins. And you can see how there's the two ditches. On the one, idolatry is saying to God, okay, I put God on one side of my scales and I put everything else, all the good stuff, on the other side. Which one do I want? And idolatry says, I want the stuff, not God. Right? I want this stuff. On the other hand, ingratitude said, well, I don't want to do that. I want to love God, and so I won't accept any gifts. Right? No, God, only you, God, only you. I don't want any of this stuff. And so we that's the ascetic route. That's the the route of ultimate self-denial, I'm not going to receive anything good because I don't want it. It's an idol trap. I don't want it to be an idol. And so those are the two twin dangers that all human beings have always faced, going back to Adam. And so I do think in a wealthy society like ours, it's a particular temptation. And I think that some of the reason that book has resonated is, John Piper is one of my heroes. I'm so grateful. He changed my life in college, and then I was able to serve alongside him for 18 years or so when we were in Minneapolis. And his message into the midst of a wealthy society was basically God is supreme, right? The supremacy of God in all things. Find your deepest delight and satisfaction in God. The way that you glorify God is by delighting in him. And this just shook up a bunch of people who had been, comfortable. It's all about having a nice, comfortable middle-class life. And it shook people up. And so I thought, that's true. That Bible is Jesus going to do that. But then, okay, you shook them up. Now come along after, and they're going to go, okay, but I still have my wife. I still have my kids. I still have my job. I like my, chips and salsa. So what now? How do I navigate the world of fish tacos and Dr. Pepper, given that God is supreme? And so the reason I think that the success or fruitfulness in some ways of men like Piper, men like R.C. Sproul, who elevated the glory and supremacy of God, their fruitfulness in evangelicalism meant that this was going to be the next problem. And I was just, I was raised in that and thought, okay, I see it in my own life. I see it in other people. I want to help people to treasure God by enjoying his gifts and then avoiding the idolatry by generosity and by self-denial and by sacrifice and by suffering. How do you face those things? That's what proves that God really is supreme.
So maybe to put the books together a little bit, you talk about the crisis of degree in emotional sabotage, leadership and emotional sabotage, and the importance for the husband, the father, the leader to lead. Is there a way that a husband, father, man can lead in terms of rightfully ordering his affections with the things that he enjoys of the earth for his family and those around him? Absolutely,
because it starts with, at one level, it starts with enjoying them. So the one of the main applications in Strangely Bright is God made the world to communicate his glory, made things make invisible attributes visible. That's the world is not. Well, guess what? You're a made thing. God made you to do that. And as a husband and a father, you're either going to tell the truth about God or you're going to lie about it. You're either going to tell the truth to your family. You're going to tell the truth to the world around you about what kind of father is he. So when the Bible says God made fathers to image his fatherhood, okay, what are your kids? They're going to grow up in your home. What do they think fatherhood is? What have they internalized about fatherhood? So one of the statements that's come out of this for me has been, be the smile of God to your children. And that really does bring together both books, right? So because I can't remember if I said it in the second one, but be the smile of God to your children, be the smile of God to your wife was a way of saying, look, you're meant to image who God is. This is how you lead. This is how you orient a home, is by first and foremost being satisfied in God. You live under the smile of a happy father. God is happy with you in Christ. This is my beloved son in Christ, and I'm well pleased with him. Despite his sin, I'm pleased with him. That's the gospel of justification by faith alone. God's happy with us. Out of that, then, I want to communicate that to my family by playing with them, by raising them in the Lord, by delighting in them. And that's both modeling for them Strangely Bright, as well as leading them in the world.
Praise God, sir. Well, beautiful synthesis of those two. Thank you.
That was really fun. I was bringing those together. I love it.
That's great. So do you have time for one more quick question?
Absolutely.
So how much pushback did you get in order to put in the recipe for pumpkin crunch cake?
Yeah, so the reason that the pumpkin crunch cake recipe made it into Strangely Bright is that when I published Things of Earth, I think in 4 or 5 chapters, I mentioned how much I liked it. And I used it as this illustration in Things of Earth. And so I used it. And so what would happen is I would go speak someplace and I would have people come up to me afterward and they would be like, oh, we loved your book, but where do I get the recipe? But where do I get the recipe? And it was just it was just the number of, and it wasn't just, you might think, oh, the ladies wanted it. And it was the guys were like, hey, I need to tell my wife how to make this deal. What do I do? and I would sit there and go, oh, and my wife did have have the recipe online at the time, like on her, family blog or something. And so I was always like giving out like this random URL to like a family blog post, just go search, and so then when Crossway asked, a number of years ago, hey, would you want to do a small version of it? I said, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm putting the recipe in, and it's funny because everywhere I go, people go, oh, we tried it, and you are correct, sir. It is in fact that good.
Validation for your wife, I imagine.
Right? Yes, my wife makes a mean pumpkin crunch cake.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you so much. I know it's summer vacation for you. Thank you for taking time out of your summer day, baseball and the kids, to talk with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
Where would you like to send people to find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, so simplest play. I mean, only social media I have is Joe_Rigney on Twitter, and but then lots of stuff on Canon Plus. So if I was going to say what's one, well, I say lots of articles on desiring God. You can go back and find all sorts of stuff. I've gotten not dozens, half a dozen articles on empathy and various and sundry things at Desiring God. But now lots of stuff on Canon Plus.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, sir. I'll send people there.
Great.